It started like any other board meeting. Sleek marble floors, polished oak tables, glasses of still water perfectly aligned. The CEO, Richard Kane, strolled in with his signature arrogance, straightening his bespoke navy suit and smirking like a man who thought he owned the world. Everyone stood, except her. In the back of the room, seated quietly in a modest gray cardigan and flat shoes, was a woman no one seemed to recognize. Her name tag simply read M. Rose. No title, no company, no introduction. Richard glanced at her with that smirk, the one he wore when speaking to interns or waiters, and said loud enough for the room to hear, "Well, looks like HR brought in someone's grandmother to audit the place." How thoughtful. Laughter rippled across the boardroom. Some chuckled out of fear, others because they thought it was funny. Most just lowered their eyes. The woman looked up slowly, meeting Richard's gaze with calm, steady eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply said, "Please, don't let me interrupt. Proceed." Richard tilted his head. "You're not interrupting, ma'am. In fact, you're welcome to sit in, as long as you don't knit during the meeting." More laughter. His assistant winced. He was performing, of course. The acquisition had just gone through. His firm had officially purchased a mid-sized tech company the day before, a startup with strong revenue, near zero debt, and a mysterious founder who had stayed anonymous throughout the negotiations. Nobody had met her. Nobody had seen her. Richard assumed she was some mid-level engineer with a lucky streak. Quiet. Smart, maybe, but irrelevant now that the real suits had taken over. The woman, still M. Rose on her tag, remained silent, hands folded neatly on the table. The meeting began. Richard talked about scaling quickly, cutting inefficiencies, and reinventing the culture. It was code for layoffs and control. He talked a lot. About data, margins, expansion, dominance. About smart men making fast decisions. Not once did he ask for input. Not once did he look her way. But the whole time, the woman watched. Not the way a spectator would, but the way a chess master studies a novice. Patiently, curiously, almost amused by the chaos she knew would come. She'd been in rooms like this before. Many, but never as the ghost. And still, the CEO pressed on. This company, he boomed, was built on a simple product. Too simple, if you ask me. Our job now is to elevate it. Clean house. Think bigger. Get rid of the legacy thinking. He paused for effect, then turned and looked directly at her. And maybe even clear out some old furniture. A few people exchanged glances. The temperature dropped. Everyone felt it. The cruelty, the jab, the tone. But nobody said a word. Except her. "For a man who talks about legacy," she said softly, "you know remarkably little about it." Silence. You could hear the air conditioner hum. A pencil rolling. A throat being cleared nervously. Richard laughed, too loudly. "Sorry, do you know something I don't?" She nodded once. "Everything." It was quiet again. A younger exec whispered something into his assistant's ear. She looked it up on her tablet, eyes going wide. Meanwhile, Richard leaned forward. "Ma'am, Ms. Rose, was it? Look, I don't mean to be rude, but this is a high-level executive meeting. I'm sure your intentions are sweet, but this isn't a charity." That was it. The final blow. He'd assumed she was the janitor's mother. Or an admin's aunt. Maybe someone lost on the wrong floor. But definitely not a woman of significance. She was too plain, too quiet, too composed to matter. What he didn't know, what he never even bothered to ask, was that the woman sitting across from him, the one he publicly mocked in front of a dozen board members, was Margaret Rose. The founder, the architect, the sole owner of the very company he thought he had just acquired. The sale hadn't gone through. Not yet. She had signed no final documents. She had let them believe. Let him believe. And now, she was watching the whole show, his show, unfold, just as she had expected. Predictably. Arrogantly. Blindly. A storm was coming, but Richard Kane didn't know it yet. He thought he had crushed a flower. He didn't realize it was a root. For a moment after Richard's final insult, Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. She let silence speak for her. Cold, deliberate, heavier than any words she might have used. But inside, her mind wasn't silent at all. It was roaring. Not with anger. With memory. Because Margaret Rose, this simple woman, in her gray cardigan, hadn't always been silent, nor simple, nor forgotten. She had simply chosen to step away from the noise, to build alone, away from the spotlight men like Richard Kane worshipped. She had learned long ago that power wasn't in how loudly you spoke, but how well you listened when others underestimated you. She looked around that boardroom now, her eyes drifting, not to the suits or their slideshows, but to the polished walnut table. Her fingertips brushed it lightly, almost absently. They didn't know, of course, that this exact table had once been in her garage. 30 years ago, Margaret had stood in that very garage in Newark, New Jersey, hands covered in engine oil, trying to fix a broken compressor she'd bought from a scrapyard for $20. She was 25 then, a single mother, her son barely 3 years old, her husband long gone. The neighbors laughed when they saw her dragging metal parts into the garage. "Playing engineer now, huh, Maggie?" they teased. "How about you try fixing your life first?" They didn't know she already was. At night, she would put her son to sleep with secondhand books, mostly science manuals from the 70s, and then return to the cold garage with only a desk lamp and a spiral notebook of equations she taught herself to solve. Her fingers cracked from the cold. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But her mind? Alive, sharp, hungry. She was designing something simple, not glamorous, not world-changing, just useful. A compact airflow module that could cut energy usage in mid-sized HVAC systems by 17%. It wouldn't change lives overnight, but over time, it could save corporations millions. That was her angle. Solve a problem no one cared about, but everyone needed fixed. She tested version after version, most of them failing. The compressor cracked. The circuits shorted. The first prototype caught fire. She nearly gave up, until she remembered her son's cough that winter. The air in their apartment was bad. They couldn't afford better. Necessity isn't just the mother of invention. Sometimes, it's the mother herself. She didn't have investors. No funding rounds. Just a pawned wedding ring, a $1,000 grant from a local women's business fund, and the iron will of a woman who had been laughed at one too many times. Within 3 years, her design was patented. Within 5, she was fulfilling contracts to hospitals. By year 10, she had 4 employees, all single mothers. They worked out of an abandoned firehouse she renovated herself, plastering the walls, laying the tiles, wiring the lights with instructions she downloaded off forums. Every piece of machinery had a name: Grace, Ruth, Esther, named after the strong women in her life who'd been overlooked, silenced, or buried under someone else's name. But Margaret? She didn't want her name on anything. She didn't need it. She just wanted the work to speak. And it did, quietly at first, then louder. Her clients grew: schools, clinics, eventually data centers looking to slash power consumption. She reinvested every dollar into R&D, never bought a luxury car, never took a vacation. Her reward wasn't lifestyle, it was freedom. Freedom to hire who she wanted. To reject funding offers from arrogant men in suits who talked over her during meetings. Freedom to fire suppliers who treated her staff like maids instead of engineers. Her success was quiet, deliberate, and dangerous to men like Richard Kane, because it proved something terrifying, that a woman, without connections, legacy, or a brand, could build an empire on her own terms, and not just survive, but thrive. Margaret never marketed herself. No TED Talks, no press photos. When her company finally appeared on the radar, racking up efficiency awards, outperforming competitors by margins Wall Street couldn't ignore, the suits came sniffing. Richard Kane was just the latest. His offer had been slick, glossy, full of buzzwords and charm. They wanted her patents, her process, her name, though they didn't know it was hers. She'd let the lawyers talk, let the dance unfold, and she watched how they assumed the founder was a man, how they addressed all emails to a non-existent Mr. Rose, how they described their vision to elevate her work as if it had been scribbled on a napkin in some garage. She watched, waited, measured, and agreed to meet. Finally, in person, today. She didn't tell anyone who she was. No announcements, no introductions. She just walked into the building she once mortgaged her home to build and let them reveal themselves. And they had. Oh, how they had. Richard Kane had revealed everything she needed to know about him in 15 minutes. The cruelty, the misogyny, the belief that power was loud and worn on your sleeve. But Margaret wore hers differently. Now, in this room, decades after her first blueprint was drawn with shaking fingers on an oil-stained notepad, She saw clearly. Nothing had changed. They still judged by shoes, by wrinkles, by whether a woman smiled when she was spoken to. But she had changed. She didn't need validation. She came for clarity. So when Richard Kane asked that final question, "Do you know something I don't?" he had no idea how deep the answer went. She rose slowly from her seat. Not dramatically, not with anger, but with the stillness of a mountain that had taken its time to form. "Everything," she said again, her voice low. This time, someone in the room stood up. Not Richard, but the junior analyst who had been furiously typing. He leaned toward his boss and whispered something urgent. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What?" The assistant spoke up now, holding her tablet toward him. "She's Margaret Rose," she said. "The Margaret Rose. The founder. The sole shareholder. Sir, she owns the company." Richard blinked. A few in the room gasped audibly. The CFO dropped his pen. "She owns," he stammered. "But we thought the founder was." Margaret turned toward him, finally smiling. "You thought wrong," she said gently. Then she looked at Richard. "You see, Mr. Kane, you didn't buy my company. You bought a meeting, a seat at the table, a chance to prove you were worthy of what I built. And you failed." She turned to leave. No anger, no theatrics, just a quiet revolution, sealed with a cardigan, a spine of steel, and 3 simple words. "I remember everything." She walked out of the boardroom without another glance. Behind her, the empire she built stood tall, no longer silent, no longer underestimated. But she remained what she always had been, a simple woman, just not the kind they ever saw coming. Margaret didn't walk out to applause. There was no standing ovation, no dramatic music score, just footsteps, hers, soft and measured against the marble floors that had once made her nervous. Back then, she would have second-guessed her every step. But now, every footfall was intentional. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. And when the elevator door closed behind her, she exhaled not with relief, but with resolve. Outside the building, New York pulsed as always. Traffic moved like blood through veins of concrete and steel. The cold January air bit into her cheeks, but Margaret didn't notice. Her mind was already ahead, already recalibrating. The boardroom was only the beginning. Because what Richard Kane didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just about his behavior. It wasn't even about her dignity. It was about principle, legacy, what we teach men like him when they mistake restraint for weakness, what we allow them to get away with when we choose silence over confrontation. And Margaret had been silent long enough. She took out her phone, dialed a number she hadn't called in nearly 6 years. A familiar voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Margaret, I need the original charter," she said, "and the private board resolution we drafted in 2014. There was a pause. "You're activating it?" "Yes." "After all these years?" "Yes." "You sure?" I was sure the moment he called me old furniture. The voice on the other end exhaled softly, then chuckled. "I'll prep the papers. By the way, the press is already calling." "Let them wait." Margaret hung up. She walked east, past the shops and glass towers, past a younger version of herself reflected in the windows, slim, uncertain, invisible. She no longer recognized that woman, but she carried her still. That version of herself had endured, fought, and now, the older version, the one with crow's feet and iron in her bones, would do what the younger never could. She wouldn't just survive disrespect. She'd answer it. By the time Richard Kane recovered from the shock in the boardroom, the storm had already begun forming. His executive team split into factions, those who scrambled to verify Margaret's identity and those who tried to rewrite what had just happened. But the truth was already circulating. Screens lit up across the company's main building. News alerts, leaked photos, whispers through internal messaging apps. The woman they'd seen in the gray sweater? She wasn't some guest. She wasn't a harmless old lady brought in by HR. She was the company. Every patent, every dollar, every floor of the building they sat in had grown from her hands. And the man who had humiliated her? He didn't even own the ink on the contract yet. By noon, Margaret was sitting at a small cafe downtown, black coffee in one hand, a manila folder in the other. Inside, legal leverage. Documents few people knew existed. Provisions she had written into her company's bylaws decades ago. Quiet protections. Triggers she could pull if ever the company fell into the wrong hands. It wasn't about control. It was about protection. She never intended to use them. Until now. She emailed the scanned documents to her legal team with one line. Time to remind them who they're dealing with. Meanwhile, Richard tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. He called an emergency press meeting, crafted a statement filled with half-truths and buzzwords. We respect the founder immensely. There was a misunderstanding. We're in full alignment. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had something better than a press release. She had history, and people talk, especially when the truth is more satisfying than fiction. Her story started spreading like wildfire. First through industry circles, then on social media. Photos of her workshop, interviews from decades ago that had never aired, testimonials from former employees who called her the best boss they'd ever had. Not because she paid them the most, but because she listened. Because she respected them when no one else did. By evening, hashtags trended. Hashtag Simple Woman built it. Hashtag Rose Not Kane. Hashtag She owns it all. Margaret stayed silent. She spent the evening at her apartment in Brooklyn, watching the city glitter from the window, thinking of her son, now grown, a scientist in Boston with 2 daughters of his own. He called as always. Mom, you're all over my feet. You okay? I'm fine. Are you doing this on purpose? Yes. There was a long pause, then a quiet. Good. The next morning, Margaret walked back into the building, not as a ghost, not as a guest, but as herself. This time, no one laughed. The security guard stood when she entered. The receptionist looked like she'd seen a myth walk in. Margaret nodded politely, not out of spite, but out of grace. She didn't need to scold the world for underestimating her. The truth had already done that. She walked into the executive floor unannounced. The team was gathered. Richard looked up, less smug now, more pale, more aware of every word he'd said the day before. Margaret, he began, standing up. Look, I want to apologize. What I said, what I implied, it was. She raised a hand. Stop. He did. I'm not here for your apology, Richard. I'm here to set the record straight. She handed him a single piece of paper. He scanned it quickly, then again. His face dropped. This is a reverse acquisition clause, he whispered. You're enacting a full buyback? Yes. As of 9 a.m. today, you no longer hold any claim over this company. The funds you wired will be returned in full, with a 3% loss for the inconvenience you've caused. You can't do this. I just did. His voice cracked. But we signed. No, she said. You assumed. You swaggered in and mocked someone you didn't bother to research. That mistake cost you. The room was dead silent. Richard's jaw clenched, but there was no comeback. Only shame. Margaret turned to the rest of the board. For the record, she said, this is not revenge. This is realignment. A reminder to all of us. Never confuse modesty with mediocrity. Never assume the quietest person in the room is the least powerful. She looked at a young woman standing at the back of the room, barely 25, likely an intern. Their eyes met. The girl straightened up. This company, Margaret continued, was built to last. And it will. Without arrogance. Without boys in suits pretending to be kings. She turned to leave again, but paused at the door. To be clear, she said, I am a simple woman. I don't crave attention. I don't need a throne. But don't mistake that for absence. I've been here. Watching. Building. Waiting. Then she walked out. This time, not to silence, but to the sound of someone clapping. Then another. And another. Until the room, once ruled by ego, was filled with the echo of respect. Earned, not demanded. Margaret didn't smile. She simply nodded. She still had work to do. Margaret didn't return to the boardroom after that. She didn't need to. The echo of her words lingered in that space far louder than the voices of men who used to dominate it. What she had left behind wasn't just shock. It was a shift in power, a recalibration of perception. For the first time, they weren't just seeing a woman in a cardigan. They were seeing the architect behind everything they thought they controlled. She exited the building to a small crowd of reporters gathered near the sidewalk. A few recognized her from the headlines, now circling the globe. One shouted, Ms. Rose, is it true you bought back your company in a day? Margaret paused. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't rush to the cameras. She simply looked directly into the lens and said, You can't buy what you never truly owned. The crowd froze. The quote would go viral within the hour. But Margaret wasn't trying to go viral. She was just telling the truth. She continued walking, past the lenses, past the flashes, back into the world that had once dismissed her. It was strange, she thought, How quickly the world changed when it was forced to look again. Her same sweater, same shoes, same calm voice. But now, somehow, it all meant something. Not because she had changed, but because they had. Her next stop wasn't a news studio or a corporate summit. It was a small brick building on the east side of the Bronx. The same place she'd started 30 years ago. The old firehouse. The sign out front had faded, but she never bothered replacing it. Inside, the space still smelled faintly of oil and solder. Her first machines, Grace, Ruth, and Esther, still stood there, carefully maintained by a small crew who had stayed with her since the early days. Sandra, her operations manager, looked up from her desk and grinned. They said you were in Manhattan kicking corporate, but I was. Well, Margaret raised an eyebrow. Let's just say we're back in control. Sandra laughed. They never had control, Maggie. They just had suits. Margaret smiled. And no stitching in them. She walked deeper into the space, her fingertips grazing the machines. So much had changed. But not this. Not the hum of creation. Not the grounded simplicity of solving a real problem, quietly, without ego. That was what Richard had never understood. Power wasn't found in titles or balance sheets. It was found in ownership, not of things, but of your time, your purpose, your truth. And truth, Margaret knew, always came out, eventually. By noon, the industry had erupted. Margaret's story hit every outlet. But it wasn't the twist that fascinated people. It wasn't even the reverse buyout or the legal jujitsu that stunned analysts. It was her, a woman they had never heard of, a name not taught in business schools, a face absent from award shows. And yet, she had built something extraordinary. It wasn't just the company. It was the way she had built it. Quietly, sustainably, respectfully. While the world chased unicorns and billion-dollar burn rates, she had chosen another path. One rooted in community, in craft, in clarity. Journalists scrambled to dig up old interviews. A podcast from 2009 surfaced, where she'd spoken for 35 minutes about the importance of dignity in manufacturing. No one had listened then. It had 52 plays. Now, it had 4.8 million. In it, she said one line that was now being shared across every platform. I never wanted to be the richest. I just wanted to build something that couldn't be taken from me. The irony, of course, was that she had built something that couldn't be taken. Not because it was invincible, but because she was. Margaret had never made herself the brand. That was intentional. She didn't want her company's worth to depend on her face or her charisma. She wanted it to stand on its own integrity. And now that integrity had become its greatest shield. Behind closed doors, the board of Richard's firm scrambled. Their investors were furious. The stock had dipped. Public backlash mounted. Articles with headlines like, "How a CEO Lost a Company with One Insult," flooded the business pages. Richard himself hadn't been seen since the meeting. He was silent. But Margaret knew it wasn't humility. It was damage control. She received a letter later that week, delivered by hand. It was from Richard. It wasn't long. No theatrics. No excuses. It read, "Ms. Rose, I misunderstood everything. You, the company, what leadership really is. I don't ask for forgiveness. I know I haven't earned that. But I do thank you. Not for what you taught me, but for what you didn't say. For the silence that made me listen. Richard." She folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. Not out of sentiment, but out of respect for what silence could still do. Margaret wasn't interested in revenge. She didn't believe in it. What she believed in was return. The return to truth, to balance, to something better than what came before. And now, she was preparing for that return. She didn't want her story to end with a mic drop. She wanted it to ripple. So she started writing again. Not speeches. Not memoirs. Blueprints. For a new initiative. A mentorship fund for women over 40 who had left the workforce. Mothers, caregivers, widows, women forgotten by an industry obsessed with youth. She named it the Rose Table. Not after herself, but after the table in her old garage, where it all began. Her first public appearance followed a month later. It wasn't a press event. It was a workshop at a community college in Newark. 20 women in folding chairs. Some with babies on their laps. Some in secondhand blazers. All with questions. Margaret answered every single one. No media coverage. No hashtags. Just transformation. One woman at a time. That was the revelation Richard never had. And the world, slowly, was catching up. Her email was flooded with offers. Book deals, documentaries, podcasts. She said no to all of them, except one. A letter from a girl in Kansas, 14 years old. Read the story online. Wrote on loose leaf with a pencil. They laughed at me because I don't dress like the other girls. But I read about you. And now I don't care if I look simple. Because I'm going to be the kind of woman they don't see coming, too. Margaret wept when she read that. Not because it flattered her, but because it reminded her of the girl she used to be. Alone in a cold garage. No applause. No headlines. Just the quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, she could matter. She never wanted to be famous. She only ever wanted to matter. And now she knew. She did. Not because the world said so, but because she had built something no one could steal. And that, finally, was her revelation. Not that the world underestimated women like her, but that it always would. And she would rise anyway. Spring arrived early that year. The trees along the Hudson bloomed pink before the calendar gave them permission. The wind grew softer, the light more generous. But Margaret Rose noticed none of it, at least not consciously. Her days were full now. Meetings not with shareholders, but with mothers, veterans, former nurses, women who had paused their dreams because life had demanded more urgent things from them. The Rose Table had grown faster than anyone expected. Within 8 weeks of launching, it had 5,200 applications. By week 12, it had funded 312 projects, mobile dental clinics, eco-friendly water systems, small software tools that made big lives easier. Some ideas were messy, undercooked, unpolished. Margaret loved those the most, because she remembered what it was like to build something that looked like nothing at first, but held everything inside it. The irony, of course, was that Margaret was now more visible than ever. People recognized her at coffee shops. Strangers approached her with tears, with admiration, with apologies for once thinking someone like her was small. She handled it with grace, though it never got easier. Fame had never been her goal. Recognition was only ever the consequence of doing things right for long enough. She had been invited back to the business school that once rejected her grant proposal. "We'd love for you to give the commencement address," they said. "Your story is legendary." Margaret didn't laugh. Not because she was angry, but because she understood what they meant. Legendary in the way myths are, because people still found it easier to believe a man with no product could raise $1 billion than a woman in sneakers could quietly build an empire. She declined the invitation, respectfully. She didn't want to speak to graduates dressed in caps and gowns. She wanted to speak to the ones who never got to graduate, the ones who had to choose between tuition and rent, the ones who were told to settle, to simplify, to be quiet. So instead of a speech, she returned to her original firehouse once more and opened it, permanently. Not as a museum, not as a memorial, but as a makerspace, a think tank, a kitchen table for ideas that couldn't afford conference rooms. It became a kind of sacred ground, though Margaret never used those words. The young women called it the Forge, because that's what it felt like, a place where ideas were beaten, reshaped, made strong. Some days they failed. Some days they screamed. But every day they built. The corporate world watched from a distance now. Quiet. Humbled. Still a little confused. They couldn't categorize her. She didn't IPO. She didn't sell. She didn't partner. She created her own economy of trust, competence, and time. And it worked. Richard Kane never returned to the spotlight. He resigned from his firm 6 weeks after the boardroom incident. A quiet press release. No interviews. No spin. Margaret heard he was working with a nonprofit in Detroit, helping displaced workers find new roles in green tech. She didn't reach out, but she wished him well. Not out of sentiment, but out of principle. Even arrogance deserved a path to redemption. Her son came to visit more often now. So did her granddaughters. They didn't understand yet what she had done, but they watched her carefully. And Margaret noticed how they carried themselves, how they interrupted less, how they asked better questions. They were learning from her in the same way the world finally had, slowly but irrevocably. The media still requested interviews. Forbes, Bloomberg, Oprah. She granted only one, to a local high school journalism club from Newark. 6 nervous students with notepads and hoodies, asking brilliant, clumsy questions like, "Did you always know you'd be successful?" She smiled. "No," she said. "I only ever knew I wouldn't stop." They wrote a beautiful piece. Called it, "The Woman They Didn't See Coming." She framed it and hung it in the Forge. As the months passed, she found herself thinking more and more about legacy. not in the grand, public sense, but in the quiet, personal one. What do you leave behind that lasts longer than applause? That's the question that kept her up now. Not regrets. Not what-ifs. Just that question. She thought back to the table again. Not the one in the boardroom. The one in her garage, where her son sat as a toddler, drawing spaceships while she soldered circuit boards. Where she burned her first design. Where she cried when she finally made it work. That table had seen everything. The wins. The failures. The nights no one knew about. It was still in storage, in a warehouse she forgot she owned. One day, she asked Sandra to retrieve it. They placed it in the forge at the center of the room. No polish. No restoration. She wanted the burns and scratches to show. She wanted every woman who walked through those doors to see it and know. This is where greatness begins. Not in offices. Not in luxury. But in effort. In endurance. In the quiet. She didn't put a plaque on it. She just sat there sometimes, when the building was empty, and ran her hands along the grain. Sometimes she wrote there. Sometimes she just thought. And once, late one evening, she wrote a letter. It was to her younger self. You were never invisible. You were just unrecognized. But don't confuse silence for insignificance. You are building something no one sees yet. One day they will. But more importantly, one day you will too. Keep going. You are the revolution wearing a cardigan. Love. The woman they didn't see coming. She folded it, sealed it, and left it in the drawer of the old table for someone else to find. Someday. Years passed. The world changed. But the story of Margaret Rose remained, passed from mother to daughter, whispered in classrooms, etched into the minds of anyone who ever sat at that table and dared to believe they could start something. People still called her the simple woman. She never corrected them, because she was simple. Simple in her mission. Simple in her values. Simple in her refusal to bow to noise, ego, or expectation. But she was never small, never soft, never less. And in the end, it wasn't her title, her wealth, or her fame that defined her. It was the unshakable, undeniable, unstoppable truth she proved. That greatness doesn't always enter with a roar. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, sits at the back of the room, and waits until the world is finally ready to listen.